Hello, 7th graders, and welcome to today's Explainer. Get ready, because we're about to travel back in time to one of the most complex, turbulent, and literally transformative eras in the United States history, the 1960s and 70s. We're going to explore the Vietnam War, but we aren't just looking at the battlefield. We're going to look really closely at what happened right here at home, specifically how government policy directly sparked massive public protests, and how everyday citizens stepped up to challenge the status quo.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today's journey. 1. The Vietnam War escalates. 2. Civic challenge and protest. 3. Making a historical claim. Well, actually pause the history midway to learn a key historian skill there. 4. A quick knowledge check. And finally, 5. Vietnamization and the aftermath.
Section 1. The Vietnam War escalates.
You know, to really understand the protests of this era, we first have to understand the policy behind them. Back in the mid-1960s, the U.S. government committed heavily to military operations in Southeast Asia. Official records from the National Archives show a rapid escalation. In August 1964, following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Congress passed a resolution giving the president broad authority to expand the war. And this led to massive troop deployments and sustained bombing campaigns. But look at what happens next. Almost immediately, in April 1965, a group called Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, organized a huge peace march on Washington. By May, we're seeing the very first national teach-ins happening at over 100 colleges.
So what does this all mean? Well, it brilliantly illustrates a direct cause and effect relationship between the government's policy decisions and the growing public pushback. As the government escalated the war through the Tonkin Gulf Resolution and increased bombings, the public reaction definitely wasn't passive. It triggered an immediate, powerful wave of civic challenge. Students didn't just stay in their dorms studying. They organized teach-ins, marches, and massive demonstrations. The policy literally birthed the protest.
Section 2. Civic Challenge and Protest.
Now, you might be wondering, who exactly were these protesters? Well, a massive social movement was defining the era, led primarily by young people, the baby boomers, who were stepping up to challenge the traditions of their parents' generation. Campuses became the absolute epicenters for this civic challenge. You had the rise of the New Left, which was an activist movement seeking sweeping social reforms. In 1960, the Students for a Democratic Society formed, and in their 1962 manifesto, the Port Huron Statement, they demanded ordinary people get more participation in the democratic process. Then you had the free speech movement at UC Berkeley in 1964. Students there literally surrounded a police car for 32 hours to protect their right to advocate for political causes on campus. And by 1965, as we saw, these campus movements had evolved into those massive national anti-war teach-ins.
But it's absolutely crucial to note that the anti-war movement eventually expanded far beyond just college students. As the war dragged on, returning soldiers began speaking out against the conflict they had just fought in. John Kerry, a former Navy lieutenant, testified before the U.S. Senate in 1971 as a member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He stated, "We could come back to this country, we could be quiet, we could hold our silence, we could not tell what went on in Vietnam, but we feel that we have to speak out." Looking objectively at the historical record, this shows just how deep the civic challenge went. It wasn't just civilians, it was veterans themselves using their voices to try and impact government policy.
Section 3. Making a historical claim. And for this part, I'm going to invite you into a bit of a historian's workshop.
All right, 7th graders, it's time to put on your historian hats. A huge part of studying history isn't just memorizing a bunch of random dates. It's learning how to look at primary sources and actually prove historical connections. What's incredibly interesting about these National Archives records is the super tight chronological link they show. On April 30, 1970, President Nixon went on television to announce an expansion of the war into neighboring Cambodia. Just days later, on May 4, protests at Kent State University in Ohio ended in tragedy when National Guard troops fired into a crowd, killing 4 students. And on May 15, similar violence occurred at Jackson State College in Mississippi, resulting in 2 deaths.
Let's step-by-step model how historians use this kind of official evidence to build a solid argument. Step 1 is making the claim. Our claim here is that President Nixon's policy to invade Cambodia directly triggered severe nationwide campus unrest. Step 2 is the evidence. We pull this right from the historical timeline. Nixon's announcement on April 30th, followed immediately by the Kent State tragedy on May 4th and Jackson State on May 15th. Finally, step 3 is the reasoning. Because the nationwide student strikes and the tragic campus violence happened literally within days of the president's public announcement, the dates undeniably prove a direct cause and effect relationship between the government's policy and the public's protest. And there you have it. That is exactly how you build a solid historical claim.
Section 4. Quick knowledge check. Let's see what we've learned. I want to see how well you've locked in these historian skills with a quick retrieval exercise. Based on our timeline evidence, what specific government policy announcement served as the catalyst for the tragic protests at Kent State and Jackson State? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it. Really think back to that cause and effect relationship we just mapped out. And the answer is the April 1970 invasion of Cambodia. If you got that right, fantastic job. Analyzing timelines and connecting policies to public reactions is exactly how we lock in those crucial historical facts. Section 5. Vietnamization and the aftermath.
Okay, let's jump back into our historical narrative. The overwhelming public protest across the country, combined with real struggles on the battlefield, put immense pressure on the U.S. government to find an exit strategy from Vietnam. This brings us to Vietnamization. This was President Nixon's policy, and the goal was to train and equip South Vietnamese forces to take over combat responsibilities. This would allow the United States to gradually withdraw its own troops. So, the crucial point here is that Vietnamization wasn't just a military strategy. It was very much a domestic political strategy designed to quiet the massive anti-war protests at home by finally bringing American soldiers back.
However, public trust took another massive hit in 1971 with the leak of the Pentagon Papers. These were secret official government documents that ended up being published by the media. They revealed that previous administrations had secretly expanded the war and deliberately misled the public about their intentions in Vietnam. The release of these documents deeply disillusioned the American public, essentially proving to many citizens that their government had not been entirely truthful with them.
Let's move forward and see how this all builds to the war's ultimate conclusion. In January 1973, a peace agreement was finally signed. By March, U.S. forces were given 60 days to withdraw, which effectively ended American military involvement. But, the peace in Vietnam was fractured. Without U.S. combat support, South Vietnam simply couldn't hold off the North. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon, and South Vietnam surrendered. The sheer cost of this conflict is just staggering. Over 1.5 million Vietnamese combatants and civilians lost their lives. More than 58,000 U.S. troops died. But alongside that devastating human toll, historians often point to another, invisible casualty of the Vietnam War, a lasting loss of consensus and confidence in American political culture. The combination of the war's escalation, the intense civic protests, and shocking revelations like the Pentagon Papers left behind a fractured society where citizens fundamentally question the authority and honesty of their government. I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. How does the loss of political consensus from the Vietnam era continue to shape the way citizens challenge government policies today? When we look at modern protests and civic action, we are often seeing the direct legacy of the 1960s. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, 7th graders. Keep asking great questions, keep looking closely at the evidence, and I'll see you next time.